You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 3rd of February 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up, Benjamin Netanyahu becomes the first foreign leader to visit Donald Trump in Washington. We'll examine what each man stands to gain and to lose. Also ahead in the next 60 minutes... Donald Trump imposes tariffs and Canada's reaction to its US neighbours reaches as far as the stalls of an international hockey game. What can Ottawa do? And as the British Prime Minister joins a meeting of the EU's 27 leaders for the first time since Brexit, we'll ask what kind of reset we can expect. Plus,
that's the place to be when you receive an Oscar nomination. I was on set, I was dragging a dummy around, a dead body.
We hear from the makeup artist responsible for the special effects in the body horror spectacular The Substance. Plus the papers and Monocle's Tokyo Bureau Chief and Senior Asia Editor brings us the headlines from Japan. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, a look at what else is happening in today's news. The US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has told Panama it must make immediate changes to the way it manages its canal. President Donald Trump has said the US is to cut off all future funding to South Africa, and police in Berlin say more than 160,000 people have attended a rally outside the German parliament in protest at the far right. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, the first world leader to be invited to the White House is often seen as a moment when the foreign policy tone of the new president is set. So what does this week's visit to Washington by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu signify for the direction America will take for the next 4 years? Well, I'm joined now by Julie Norman, who's a Senior Associate Fellow on the Middle East programme at the Royal United Services Institute here in London. A very warm welcome back to Monocle Radio. Good morning, Julie.
Good morning, Emma.
So before he even got on the plane, Prime Minister Netanyahu was saying that the Middle East can be redrawn. What do we think he means by that?
Yeah, so we've heard this language from Netanyahu. I would say it refers to a couple of things. One is simply to try and continue what Israel has really been doing over this last fall with not focusing so much on Gaza, but on really quelling Hezbollah, on, I would say, taking advantage of the fall of the Assad regime in Syria and perhaps taking more action against Iran. So I think that kind of regional realignment, if you were, or redrawing has been somewhat in motion, and again, largely in response to those actions after October 7th. The other thing that I think Trump is going to want to focus on is a normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel and seeing what those contours might look like. So a lot of different parts of the region that I think will be discussed in this week's meeting.
Lots of moving parts. We'll talk about Saudi Arabia in a moment, but this idea that Netanyahu is seizing on a moment when things look as if they might be going Israel's way. And there was always that sense that Netanyahu and Trump would get together and Trump would turn around and say, finish the job. How much is that possible now, given the fact that we have a ceasefire? We have concerted efforts at the moment to try to bring about a lasting peace in Gaza.
That's right. So one thing that is slated to start later this week is talks to get to phase 2 of the ceasefire, to get to that permanent end of the war. This is something that has always been a sticking point, if you can say, and really difficult, I would say, for Netanyahu to agree to. Israel has wanted to maintain a right to finish Hamas, to continue the war as they see fit and as needed. Obviously, for Palestinians, for Hamas, that permanent end is what they are looking for. So I think what everyone is watching Trump for this week is to how much he is actually going to pressure Israel to end the war. He has suggested that that is what he wants. His administration reportedly is not too pleased with this phased nature of the ceasefire. They really want it to wind down. But I think if they are able to offer anything to Netanyahu to get him to agree with that, we're all kind of watching what that offer might be. If it would be, green lighting further expansion into the West Bank, perhaps annexation. We've heard Trump talk about displacement of Gazans, or again, something more regional. So Netanyahu isn't going to agree to just pull out of Gaza lightly. And so I think whatever deal making Trump has in mind is something that a lot of us are very concerned about.
When you mean the sort of incentives that he can offer Benjamin Netanyahu, there was a feeling when the ceasefire came about, and indeed Donald Trump has claimed credit for the Gaza ceasefire, that actually arms were twisted to ensure that Netanyahu stepped up and agreed to it. I mean, what is the balance of power here between these two men?
Yes, so I think we saw it in play in that first ceasefire agreement where Trump's administration, his envoy, as you said, really did put the very fast, hard pressure on Netanyahu, said, we want this deal, we're getting it done, you better come along with it. And Netanyahu, I would say, has been pulled between the U.S. and now Trump on the one hand, and then between the more right-wing elements in his government on the other. To get that first phase through, he went along with the U.S. I think he wants to stay on good terms with Trump. Again, there are these bigger regional aspirations at play as well. But that right-wing element of his government and even Israeli public opinion more broadly may constrain what he's able to do in these next moves, again, unless there's something even more attractive on the table.
Tell us more about the wider picture. I mean, you mentioned Hezbollah, you mentioned the fall of in Lebanon, you mentioned the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. What is each man after at the moment, at a moment when, at an instant when there is an enormous amount of flux in the region?
Yes, so I would say two real key things for Netanyahu. One, even though as all eyes have been on Gaza, I think we should really be keeping a closer eye on the West Bank, where things have been intensifying very rapidly, not only since October 7th, but really since the ceasefire went into force. Israel is looking to tighten its grip there. Members of the government have been very clear about their desire to deepen their control in the West Bank, perhaps even annex certain parts, which would make a viable Palestinian state simply impossible. So that is one, I think, primary area of focus. The other is that Israel knows that Iran is probably at its weakest point that it's been in years. They were very successful in taking out a lot of its conventional military power over the fall, but not the nuclear elements. And so there are some in Israel who are clamoring to really kind of take it to Iran to really put the pressure on either closing out the nuclear program or taking action against it. And that's something that Biden would not assist Israel in doing. They're hoping that the U.S. will under Trump. For Trump, as I mentioned, what seems to be his priority is this normalization deal between Israel and Saudi Arabia. This would build on the so-called Abraham Accords from his previous term, which normalized relations with 4 other Arab countries, including the UAE. This is something that Saudi has not walked away from, but has said they want recognition of a Palestinian state as part of this deal, which is something Israel currently is not looking to do. So I would say those are the two priorities for both of these men going into this week.
And personally for them, to what degree is this meeting going to offer a domestic benefit for Donald Trump and indeed a domestic benefit for Prime Minister Netanyahu?
Well, I'd say for Netanyahu, it's a boon. He always talks up the U.S. trips, and the fact that it's the first international meeting for Trump is something he's been vocalizing quite a lot, and especially since he has these ICC warrants about him, the ability to travel abroad to somewhere like the U.S., address the president, et cetera, is something that he is certainly touting. For Trump, too, obviously, Israel is a very political topic in the U.S. Most Republicans, most in the GOP are very pro-Israel. And so this is a way for Trump to kind of, again, show that this first meeting is going to Netanyahu, show that he's really leaning into the region and try and curry some favor there as well.
Julie Norman, thank you for joining us on The Globalist. 9:10 a.m. in Kyiv, 7:10 a.m. here in London. Russian forces are closing in on the Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk. Pokrovsk, which lies in the southern eastern region of Donetsk, is important to Moscow for several reasons. It's a gateway to the most heavily fortified areas left in Ukraine's control in Donetsk. It's also a key logistical hub. So what happens if it falls into Russian hands? Well, I'm joined now by Maria Avdiva, who's a security analyst based in Kharkiv. A very good morning to you, Maria. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Tell us about Pokrovsk. I mean, it is almost deserted, as are many places in Donetsk, but it is an absolutely crucial city to both the Ukrainians and the Russians, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. Pokrovsk was for all these years a key logistical hub for Ukrainian troops that are fighting in the area. So if you would go to any place in the eastern Ukraine, you will definitely make a stop in Pokrovsk. So it was quite a large town and it was very densely populated. So Ukraine started to evacuate people from Pokrovsk in summer. So it's important to understand that this Russian offensive, it's not weak. They started it several months ago. They are gradually pushing towards Pokrovsk, but still the situation is getting worse monthly, but still they are far from taking over the town. But of course, it's very dangerous and threatening because if Russians will be able to cut off Pokrovsk or capture the town, that they will actually effectively cut off supply routes for Ukrainian troops fighting in the area, and they will be able to further actually close their hold on the whole of Donetsk region.
So it is effectively the place through which supplies are channeled, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And it has a very strategical position. And this is why it's key for Russians and also for Ukrainian troops to have control over Pokrovsk, because the main road for supplying troops in Donetsk region, it goes through Pokrovsk and then through Chasiv Yar, which also is under constant Russian pressure.
The reports are over the weekend that the fighting intensified and that there are countless attacks. What is the likelihood that Pokrovsk could fall?
Well, Russia intensified its attacks. Actually, it coincides with Trump's team calls for a ceasefire and for kind of peace talks with Russia. And because before this happens, Russia is obviously trying to capture as much territory as they possibly can, so that they have more to talk about when these talks happen and when and if they happen. But Ukrainian troops also realize that, and the fighting for Pokrovsk is getting more and more heavy, and Ukrainian troops put everything they have to defend it, and this actually results in numerous losses, like a very high number of losses of Russian troops in that area, because for the January only over 7,000 Russian soldiers were killed just in that one area.
And I think it was last week that Ukraine claimed that the Russian military lost 1,600 men in 24 hours. And the estimate at the moment is that Russia's wartime losses are 830,000 people. I mean, this cannot be verified for lots of very obvious reasons. But when you see losses on that scale on the Russian side, from the point of view of a Ukrainian, what does this do for Ukrainian morale?
Well, this means for us that, for one hand, Ukraine is doing everything is possible to defend the territory. But on the other hand, we know that Russia does not value like every single person. They can put, as I call it, meat storms, hundreds of soldiers just to take one small spot on the map. And actually, Russian troops were not able to gain a lot of territory compared to the number of losses they have. But still, Russia is a huge country. They have a lot of men. And if they don't value their people, they will continue this kind of tactics when they will put just hundreds after hundreds on the battlefield. And to fight with this tactic, Ukraine needs to be very creative and needs to have all the support from our allies, because we cannot defeat Russia just in the field. We need to be very elaborate. And for example, recent Ukrainian steps when Ukraine is launching deep strike drones to hit Russian military infrastructure or doing something on Russian territory, this kind of tactics is helping Ukraine to be more creative and not to fight in a way Russia wants this war to be held.
How much is the fate of Ukraine now seemingly falling more and more into the way that the US Trump administration is putting things? We have an envoy this weekend suggesting that both sides will have to will have to make concessions to end this war, which could include Kyiv giving up land occupied by Russia. I mean, Ukraine has dismissed this, but there is that noise, that narrative is getting louder.
Yeah, absolutely. Yesterday, President Zelensky made a very good statement, actually saying that Russia has zero interest in the negotiations. And this is, if Trump's administration wants Ukraine and Russia to talk, they need to put a lot of effort actually to put Russia to this table. Because President Putin said that he is not willing to talk to Ukraine, and actually this will look like a weakness to him if they talk after all these years. They said the Ukraine does not exist as a state. So this is for Trump's administration to show that they are really strong and to put pressure on Russia, both economically with sanctions and militarily with continuous support to Ukraine, to actually make them sit on the table and talk.
In the meantime, we have the meeting of the 27 leaders of the European Union later on today. The British Prime Minister Keir Starmer is going there. We'll talk about that. There'll be a separate item a little bit later on today's Globalist. But for the meantime, you very much get the feeling that this meeting of the European Council is going to be there to talk about Ukraine. How much is Ukraine now looking towards the European Union to perhaps pick up and to be that voice that the United States can no longer be?
Well, yeah, it's crucial because the European Union will need to step up when and if the support from the United States is going down. And actually, also President Zelensky said that in these future talks with Russia, there will be United States, Ukraine, Russia, and obviously European Union, because this is how he sees these talks, because it has the biggest role after the US, and the European countries have to be prepared. NATO secretary said that in his statement that European countries have to be prepared that Russia will try to do something. And this is what Ukraine has been warning for months, that if Russian army succeeds here, if Putin feels he is winning, they will not stop here in Ukraine. They will try something. And actually, we already see what's happening in the Baltic Sea with Russian sabotage actions when they put on fire military warehouses in European countries. And this is only the start. So if European countries will not help Ukraine to stop Russia where it is now, Putin will go further.
Maria Avdiva, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. Still to come on today's programme.
We know that the deal that the previous government secured is not working well enough.
The UK Chancellor Rachel Reeves there making overtures to Europe as the British Prime Minister Keir Starmer heads to his first meeting with all the EU's 27 leaders. We'll take the post-Brexit temperature a little later.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
It's 7:20 here in London. Let's continue now with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio is Monocle's senior news editor Chris Chermack. Good morning, Chris.
Good morning, Emma.
How's the Chermack world?
How's the Chermack world? Well, I'm still moving into my flat, so there's plenty of news on that. Still getting settled, unpacking boxes, all of that. So
Still?
that's of course still. How long?
When did you
take some time?
When did you move in?
I moved in like 3 weeks ago. I can't expect me to do everything in that time.
Upper limit, I'd say. You had half a bed until a few weeks ago.
I did have half a bed. I do now have a full bed, and I've also bought a second bed. So there you go. I'm just engulfed in beds.
It's all go at the Chermacks, right? Okay. Or it could be all go with the number of beds you've just bought. Right, let's look at the papers. What have you spotted today?
So I wanted to start in Germany because there's been a lot going on there. There are elections towards the end of this month on the 23rd of February. And you had a series of protests over the weekend, about over 160,000 people in Berlin, as you mentioned in the headlines. And this all has to do with the fact that the Christian Democrats, the center-right, the party of Angela Merkel, longtime chancellor, tried to pass a bill at the end of last week with the help of the far-right Alternative for Germany. That broke a sort of firewall, as it's called, in Germany, the idea that center parties do not work with the extreme far-right under any circumstances. And this really has caused a huge firestorm in Germany. It's going to continue today. The Christian Democrats are actually meeting. They're having their own party convention where they will pass their own sort of version of what they want to see on immigration policy, which is what this was all about. They want to essentially have a stop to immigrants and asylum seekers coming across the border into Germany. They are probably going to pass that at a party convention later today, and it really does, I guess, show the dividing lines at the moment in Germany. The Christian Democrats have shown that they have moved quite far to the right, away from the center, have alienated the Social Democrats and the Greens, who sit on very much the other side right now. So there isn't really much of a center left in Germany anymore, and that's quite striking.
There's also quite a lot of criticism of Friedrich Merz as the man pushing forward the CDU, and people had been sort of tipping him to be the next candidate for Chancellor. The fact remains is that, just looking at what Der Spiegel is talking about today, it does not pull its punches, does it? It's absolutely going for Merz. It talks about Merz shares Merkel's discomfort. Angela Merkel opposed Friedrich Merz when he pushed through a motion with the AfD. Said the failed asylum initiative of CDU leader Friedrich Merz impressively demonstrates how unsuitable he is for the chancellery. No one could wish for such short-sightedness and strategic incompetence here. They're absolutely going out for him, and this is going to do no good at all for the CDU. Or for Germany on a much more important level.
Well, that's the more important one, perhaps, for Germany. The question for the Christian Democrats actually is a little bit more open, I would say. You are seeing magazines like Der Spiegel and others, sort of, if you will, the sort of legacy papers laying into Friedrich Merz for daring to work with the far right. Of course, what voters are going to say about this, we don't know. The Alternative for Germany, the far right was polling second in Germany. So, yes, Friedrich Merz, with his move, which he's been quite unapologetic about, has signaled that he is moving away from the center. He might lose votes in the center, but the question is whether he gains votes from the far right as a result of it. So we will see what happens for voters later on this month. The big question, of course, after that, though, is what kind of coalition could actually happen. Would there be a coalition government? Typically, that is from the center. That would be the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats. Trust is completely broken between those two. There are now whispers of a minority government in Germany, which would be a first time in its history.
And there is, of course, the fact that remains that Germany is in an economic mess. We have recession absolutely all over the place. Let's talk about what's happening in neighbours' problems as well. It's economic issues. Just hopping over to France. Another budget's being pushed through today. It's difficult to keep up with what's going on in France, but this is an effort by the Prime Minister Bayrou to try to impose some sort of calm and law and order on an incredibly turbulent political spectrum.
Yes, and it also follows nicely on from this Germany story, if you will, because this is the kind of political instability that Germany would hope to avoid. But the Prime Minister, François Bayrou, has announced over the weekend that he is going to try and pass a budget this week, starting with a hearing on Monday. Without the approval of the National Assembly. So he's using a sort of constitutional measure here that he can do that essentially allows him to pass a budget without Parliament's approval, which would, though, trigger a no-confidence vote in his own government. So this is what Le Monde and others are reporting, that he is going to likely trigger another no-confidence motion, which could happen on Wednesday. And then the big question becomes whether he is going to survive a no-confidence vote or whether he could be yet another failed prime minister in France. It really is incredible how many times he's having to go through this, how many times French politics are having to go through this simply to pass something like a budget. So as you say, he's making this move for stability, saying we need a budget. You can't keep opposing this. But the big question is whether he gets his budget through or not. Will the socialists in particular, and in this case the far right as well, the Rassemblement National, back him to continue to stay in office?
It seems such a terrible shame because you look at the way that France is projecting itself internationally. And in a little while, we'll talk about Emmanuel Macron has already told Sir Keir Starmer that Brexit has failed. That will be the message sent to Sir Keir Starmer later on today. But in terms of the way that France projects itself internationally, the brilliant year it had last year, we saw Emmanuel Macron standing in front of the Mona Lisa last week saying we're going to make the Louvre good for everybody who wants to come to it. There is such a good amount of capital, and yet the French ability for self-harm is breathtaking, isn't it?
Well, especially in politics. So there's plenty of capital right now for brand France, if you will, with everything that's happening outside of the political sphere, because Emmanuel Macron, of course, has shot himself in the foot by calling for an election that has led to this political instability. As a result of that as well, you're now seeing all the parties, so many different candidates jockeying for 2027. When the presidency is up for a vote, you're seeing François Hollande come back for the socialists and others. So everyone is expecting that, this is going to be a major fight for 2027. Until then, we're going to have this kind of political instability.
We can't wait. Right. Okay. Well, no, we can. Let's have a look at America. The Washington Post has a very, very good and in-depth, and so does the Wall Street Journal actually today, has a lot of coverage about the degree of access that Elon Musk has enjoyed in the last 72 hours in terms of access to personal details, budgets, and goodness knows what of the internal workings of the American government.
Yes, and there are two aspects to this. The Wall Street Journal in particular, and others, of course, are focusing. There's one aspect is the Treasury, where allies of Musk have tried to gain access to the U.S. payment system, very sensitive elements of the U.S. government that typically are not given to political appointees or politically appointed officials. That's something that happened in the Treasury Department. It led to the resignation of senior Treasury officials who had tried to block Musk's allies from getting into these sensitive payment areas. And then the same thing has happened at USAID, the development aid agency in the U.S., and that's what the Washington Post is focusing on. There were some quite extraordinary scenes at this agency as allies of Musk barged their way into USAID, wanting to get access to sensitive elements of the agency, basically all elements of the agency, including those that for which they didn't necessarily have national security clearance. Two security officials who blocked them have now been put on administrative leave, and Musk's allies have been given access to what is the world's largest provider of food assistance. Of course, all of that is also on hold at the moment because all foreign aid in the U.S. has been suspended by the Trump administration. And there is now also talk, and this the Washington Post and others report as well, of USAID itself being ended, essentially, folded into the U.S. State Department, something we have seen, by the way, here in the U.K. as well, because the same thing happened with DFID. So there is talk of USAID being folded into the State Department, led by Elon Musk, who calls it a criminal organization and says it is time for it to die.
This is going to happen very quickly, isn't it? I think that when we have, the so-called flooding the zone in terms of the narrative of what Trump's plans are, is one thing. But the fact remains that if Elon Musk and his team are going into various sensitive parts of the US government, getting access, ripping things out, tearing things down. I wonder whether the rest of the world is going to have the rug pulled out from under it very, very quickly. The speed is breathtaking.
Well, we are already seeing the consequences, certainly for the rest of the world, whether it's the tariffs that we'll be talking about shortly, but also, yes, in terms of funding, the amount of funding that is being suspended by the US at the moment, the impact that is having on NGOs and others who are being forced to shut their doors is incredible.
Chris Chermak, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. The time here in London is 7:30 a.m. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. And look now at what else we're keeping an eye on today. The US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has told Panama it must make immediate changes to the way it manages its canal. Speaking after a meeting with the country's president, he said current levels of Chinese presence violated a decades-old treaty signed by the US and Panama. Meanwhile, President Donald Trump has said the United States is to cut off all future funding to South Africa. He claimed that certain classes of people were being treated very badly. In 2023, the United States assigned $440 million in assistance to South Africa. The country's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, says he's not worried about the country's relationship with Donald Trump. And police in Berlin say more than 160,000 people have attended a rally outside the German parliament in protest at the far right. Many were carrying banners denouncing the Christian Democratic Union after the party breached a post-war taboo by seeking the support of the far-right AfD. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. President Trump has been defending his policy of imposing tariffs on goods imported from Canada, Mexico and China. He said any pain would be worth the price. He claimed the three countries have been ripping off the United States for decades. Canada has already said it will hit back with a similar import duty of 25% on US goods. Well, to explain everything, I'm joined in the studio now by Paul Waldie, Europe correspondent at the Globe and Mail. A very good morning to you, Paul.
Hi there.
We'll come to your patch of Europe in a moment because I think that's in the crosshairs of Donald Trump. But first, do we treat this as the start of an American trade war? Because we have, in three little words, American trade war, but goodness me, what consequences?
Huge consequences. I mean, these tariffs alone that come into force tomorrow are affecting the U.S.'s three largest trading partners, Canada, Mexico, and China. So definitely it's the start of a trade war in North America, but it's broadening because Trump is also looking at the EU, he's looking at other countries, and clearly tariffs are going to be the way he exercises his foreign policy and his bilateral relationships with countries.
What is this going to look like if you are Canadian? And actually, even if you're American as well, we've seen Justin Trudeau stand up in the last few hours and actually just saying directly to Americans, this is going to hurt you.
It's going to hurt Americans, but it's really going to hurt Canadians. I mean, 75-80% of Canadian trade is with the U.S. Canada's incredibly dependent on the U.S. for, many companies are dependent on the U.S. for trade relations for their business. This is going to push the country definitely into recession if it's prolonged. There are some estimates that GDP could shrink by as much as 4%, even 6% under some scenarios. Inflation is going to go up. Unemployment's going to go up. Consumers are going to spend money no matter what on almost everything they buy, spend more money on almost everything they buy. And it's going to cause incredible disruption. You have to keep in mind that the auto industry in Canada and the U.S. on the northern side has been under a free trade agreement for 60 years. And cars go back and forth as they're assembled, different parts. So how that is all going to be worked out, when the tariff is applied, how it's applied, and the impact that's going to have on the auto industry is going to be enormous.
The argument that Donald Trump has given is that nothing that Canada produces can't be produced by the Americans.
Probably, but at a higher price, right? I mean, the U.S., 60% of U.S. imports for energy come from Canada, oil and gas. So, yes, probably you can do that, but it's expensive and it takes a long time. And it's just easier to buy it from Canada, which has been status quo for 30, 40, 50 years. So it's going to hurt a lot. Americans are also going to have to pay the price because they're going to have to pay more for different products that are coming in. The tariffs actually are absorbed by Americans. They have to pay these things. So agriculture, all kinds of industries, critical industries are going to face higher pressure, higher cost pressure. So, yeah, it's really a disruptive way of trying to address a problem that Canadians cannot get their heads around. Why is Canada being singled out for this when the excuse is that there's fentanyl flowing in and there's illegal immigrants flowing in, and it's minuscule, the numbers on the Canadian border.
The reason that Donald Trump gave it, and I mentioned it at the start of this interview, is that he accused Canada of ripping off the United States for decades. Where would he find the grounds for that claim?
And that's the thing. He's all over the place. I mean, he's talking about fentanyl flowing in from Canada, and it represents, I think, 9,000 kilograms versus 15 tons coming out of Mexico. Illegal immigration, I think, is 23,000 arrests by U.S. border officials on the Canadian border versus 1.5 million on the Mexican border. This vague notion of trade deficit is strange because when you calculate it with services and other things, it's much smaller than he talks about. So that's part of the problem, because I think Canadian politicians, Canadian officials don't know what it will take to address this. Like, how do you negotiate your way out of this when you don't really understand the premise surrounding it? So I think that's the real complicating factor, is they don't really know what it will take to get the tariffs dropped.
Right. So the question does come, how do they negotiate their way out of it? Because we also have Justin Trudeau, who's a lame duck prime minister.
Well, that complicates the problem even more. Trudeau will not be prime minister as of March 9th. The Liberal Party is going through a leadership race. The new prime minister, the new leader, will become prime minister on March 9th. Parliament won't sit until the end of the month. There could be an immediate non-confidence vote, which will likely trigger an election as early as March or even April. So, yeah, politically, Canada is in a real mess right now. I think Canada has been trying to tell Trump they've introduced a $1.3 billion border security package that they'd hoped would address some of these concerns, but that hasn't worked. Trump doesn't like Trudeau, so we're not so sure that he's going to like the next leader if it is Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England. He's not exactly in Trump's good books either. So who knows how this is going to play out.
It will, and some of the predictions following this sort of whirlwind of impositions of tariffs this weekend has suggested that actually this will skew the world's economy in China's favour.
Well, there is that. I mean, already, not just China, but other countries, already Canada and Ecuador have negotiated a trade agreement. I think certainly if Trump hits the EU with tariffs, the EU will have nowhere to turn but China for certain products. Canada, the only benefit of this for Canada in one way is that for many, many decades, Canada has looked to broaden and diversify its trade, to move away from its overdependence on the U.S. And if this goes on for a long time, that will certainly force Canada to look to other trading partners, whether that's China, Europe, South America. And that might be a good thing because Canada has been far too reliant on the U.S. So this may prompt some change for Canada and its trade relations. And it also might break down some internal barriers that Canada has had for a long time between provinces. So there might be some good that comes out of it, but it's going to pale in comparison to the bad.
Paul Waldie, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
The time in Brussels is 8:39 a.m, 7:39 here in London. Now, the UK Prime Minister presses a diplomatic reset button, he hopes, today as he becomes the first British leader to join a full meeting of the EU's 27 leaders since Britain left the bloc. There's been a lot of talk of a reset of the relationship since Brexit, but where are the signs of this happening? And indeed, where is the will? Well, Stephen Hunsaker is an economic policy researcher at UK in a Changing Europe, an academic think tank hosted by King's College London here in the UK. Very good morning to you, Stephen.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us. Going into today, what is the mood music like? I mean, there's already conversations being held. Emmanuel Macron, French president, has said that Brexit has failed. Keir Starmer, before he's even sort of hopped on the Eurostar, is saying, we're not going back on Brexit. This is a done deal. The dust has settled. It just is it's sort of old roads that we're going down already, and we haven't even started, we haven't even had the first drink yet.
Exactly. The UK is especially Starmer, is taking this at a much slower pace than I think a lot anticipated. A lot saw Labour coming in, especially with the majority they're having, and saying, okay, we can be a little bit more bold with our relationship with the EU and really take a critical look at that. And instead, it has been a much more mitigated pace as to what that kind of reset is going to look like. And we still don't really have as many details as we expected to see at this point. And a lot of that actually has to do with some of these red lines that we're seeing being drawn. I mean, we're seeing Labour is saying, we're not going to do a youth mobility deal. That has been very clear. And then from the EU side, as, Starmer is there, France is also saying, like, fisheries. We want our fish, even the Danes are saying that as well. And that is going to be another kind of a critical point that I think is going to make it a little bit more difficult for the EU and the UK to kind of come to the table and actually start to talk about some of the bigger things. Let's say security, let's say TCA, let's say some of those kind of bigger talking points.
It's an interesting point that you make, actually, that no one is coming to any kind of rapprochement with any sign that anybody wants one. I mean, the European Union doesn't need us anymore.
Well, exactly. I mean, there was the Politico actually talked about, they quoted a diplomat that said, I think about the UK for 10 minutes once a week. Like, that, I think, actually summed up so well, actually, what the EU's, like, how often the EU is really thinking about the UK. I think we think about the EU much more than they think about us at this point.
Goodness me. Right. That absolutely sort of took the wind out of my sails there. Right. So let's look ahead to today, where we just have, gosh, it feels like sort of a terrible marriage, or the end of a terrible marriage a long way away, and people are still trying to work out whether we like each other. Europe's clearly moved on. So what does Keir Starmer try to get out of today? Because I think a lot of the common discussion points are focused on security, which is something that the British can do very well.
Exactly. That is actually one of the biggest kind of like bargaining chips or things that the UK can bring to the table is security. And so what is going to happen is I think that Starmer needs to play that hand and make sure that there is not something where it's only a deal on security assigned that wouldn't allow for the UK to kind of have some reciprocal benefits from something, because they have a lot of things that they want to bring to the table that they want to kind of look at with this, quote unquote reset. And so it'll be critical that there is a more kind of comprehensive deal that's looked at with the EU, whether that's on phytosanitary checks, kind of a veterinary agreement, or it's with, upcoming kind of the fishery agreement that's going to be up again for negotiation in 2026. These are the types of things that the UK can look at as, bringing to the table as well. But again, it's hard when they've drawn some red lines on certain issues that the EU seems very adamant about.
So they have to come up with a few workarounds, don't they? And one of the issues that they have is the customs union, that everybody has said they're not going to get in touch with, get going with the customs union again. There are different ideas, and they always have these wonderfully complicated names. It is the Pan-Euro-Mediterranean Convention. What's that, Stephen? And why is this a path forward, a workaround?
This is great because usually when I talk to people about PEM Convention, their eyes just glaze over. And so pretty much the PEM Convention it's not a customs union. I think that's the first thing that is really important to lay out is it's not a customs union. Instead, this is an agreement with both the 27 EU member states as well as these Mediterranean countries. So we also have in there Egypt and Jordan and Israel, Turkey, as well as the Western Balkans, Ukraine, and also are kind of the Norway and Switzerland and Iceland. And so pretty much what it is
everybody who isn't in the EU, basically.
Exactly.
The neighbours.
All the neighbours. Exactly. It's a neighbours agreement, in this case without the UK. And so it does actually make sense for the UK to be in this. Now, the only thing is that this agreement, in kind of the simplest terms, what it does is it just allows for there to be tariff-free trade between those countries and for those countries to be able to count components of the goods that they're producing towards what is kind of being, say, quote unquote, is local content being made, like for it to be counted as made in the UK, it needs to hit a certain threshold, around 45% for most goods. It can count the different elements from all of those countries, where right now all you can do is with the UK EU. So if you ship something to the EU, it needs to be primarily made of components made in the UK and the EU. This kind of broadens that range of what can be counted.
And it does, in that context, look like we are going to end up with this sort of strange piecemeal, pick and choose, bit by bit relationship with the European Union. Does that could that eventually lead one day to something a little bit cohesive?
You know, that's the difficult question, because it's things like this that are, yes, kind of a bit by bit. I mean, to be honest, the actual effects of a Penn Convention on trade is going to be modest at best. And so, but it does get the UK one step closer towards having a more normal relationship with the EU, where it's less kind of this kind of hostile atmosphere going on. And so it is these little things that maybe economically they don't make a big difference, but maybe politically they can just kind of draw the UK closer to its largest trading partner. Now, that is, a lot of people will kind of rate, like, on the Leave side will say, oh, well, you know, closer to the EU means that we're just going to be rejoining. And that seems like something that is very, very far off. And frankly, not something, I mean, both Labour has been very clear that that's off the table. But also, we never talk about how does the EU even want us back? And so I do think that there's a lot of things that can happen before you get all the way to a rejoin that can bring the UK and EU closer as just kind of normal neighbours.
We leave it where we started. Stephen Hunsaker, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. (1647) in Japan, in Tokyo, which is where we head now. Monocle's Asia editor Fiona Wilson joins us now from Tokyo. A very good afternoon to you, Fiona. Good to have you with us.
Thank you, Emma.
Right. Donald Trump is talking to the Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba this week.
Yes, that's the big political news. So Shigeru Ishiba, Japan's Prime Minister, he's not a natural diplomat, it has to be said. He's not a natural sort of schmoozer with the other leaders, but he is going to be in Washington Thursday to Saturday, and the plan is that he'll be speaking to Donald Trump on Friday, and you know, I think he'll be the second leader after Benjamin Netanyahu to get a face-to-face with Donald Trump. So it's not exactly a coup, but he will at least placate some of his critics.
It is nonetheless significant that he's getting in there early, and at the moment there have been no major rumblings when it comes to the relationship between the United States and Japan, given the nature of all the other troubles that we've been talking about this hour. What do we believe Trump's intentions for his relationship with Japan are?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, there's been so much talk about these tariffs, obviously, particularly towards China, which will obviously have a massive knock-on effect on the Japanese economy. I don't think that's what they'll be talking about. It will be all positive noises about the alliance. Ishiba's been saying he wants to take the alliance to new heights. Can't quite see that. But yeah, I think they'll be talking about security cooperation and economic cooperation.
And what do we believe that the nature of the two men's relationship could be? Because obviously this all goes down to personality politics. And you talked about Prime Minister Ishiba not being the sort of like the most natural sparring partner for Donald Trump.
Yeah, I mean, I think people always hark back to Shinzo Abe. He got in there really early with Trump in his first presidency. And a lot of people felt that made a big difference to Japan in the long run, that Japan was spared some of the worst of Trump's invective. But I think you're right. I don't see a natural relationship, a sort of personal relationship here. But, you know, Japan is a massive economic partner and Trump, you know, he's already making waves around the world. Does he want any more trouble? And I think, you know, obviously the same goes for Ishiba. Yes, it's going to be a big problem. Tariffs that hit China will hit Japan. And you only need to look back to 2019. Japan took a big hit on exports. China is its biggest export partner. And, if China's economy is suffering, so will Japan. So they're both important to each other. I don't see them laughing over a glass of whiskey, let's put it that way.
Let's move on to an astonishing story from last week in the Japan Times about Fuji TV. It held a news conference last week to address allegations of sexual misconduct by one of its former presenters. Didn't just do a sort of that very, very honourable and excellent approach, which is to be absolutely transparent. They were transparent for no less than 10 hours.
I mean, this was just the most extraordinary, some might say unnecessary epic. That's right. Fuji TV, the president and the chairman, who were actually announcing their resignation, were then subjected to 10 hours of, it was so grueling. Someone described them as cannon fodder, which I think was a fair assessment. Basically, there'd been this scandal with Masahiro Nakai. He's not just a presenter. He's one of the biggest stars in Japan. He was in this boy band called SMAP. They're massive celebrities in Japan. They've all had huge subsequent TV, acting, presenting careers. And Nakai got himself into trouble. It's not absolutely clear what happened, but it seems some kind of sexual assault. In 2023, this happened. It emerged in the tabloids in December that he'd paid the woman he allegedly assaulted quite a substantial sum of money. And I think there was a feeling that let's draw a line under it. And the public said, absolutely not. We want to know what's actually going on here and what's the plan to stop it happening again. And why is Fuji T involved at all? And they tried to hold a conference it was the middle of January, a really pathetic press conference where they said only certain people can attend, no filming, completely contrary to their role as a huge broadcaster in Japan. So they tried to put it right last week with this epic 10-hour press conference, but it just turned into the most wild ride, absolute free-for-all. Anyone who could get their hands on a microphone did. And some of it wasn't questioning, it was just ranting. And I think there was some sympathy even for the Fuji TV executives.
And just looking at very briefly, Fiona, the fact remains is the Japan Times article says that this 10-hour marathon wasn't a total failure, it actually worked.
Yeah, it's interesting. I read that piece too. I don't know if I entirely agree. I mean, I would agree in the sense that people actually felt quite sorry for the executives afterwards. And when they went in, they definitely didn't. There was a feeling that Fuji TV had tried to brush this whole thing under the carpet. They didn't want to talk about it. What happened was their huge advertisers, everybody from Toyota to McDonald's, pulled their ads from the TV channel. Their biggest US investor, Dalton, said, this is a car crash. And they felt they had to do something to put it right, which is what they tried to do. But going into that press conference, they could not have been in a worse position. So I think the feeling was, how much worse could it be? They could only come out marginally better. The first press conference had indeed been a car crash. And I think they were just keen to rectify that situation.
Fiona, thank you so much for joining us on the line from Tokyo. You're listening to The Globalist. Now, the film The Substance has undoubtedly been one of the surprises of this year's award season. The gory body horror satire was nominated for 5 BAFTAs and 5 Oscars, including Best Picture, Best Director for Coralie Farjat, and Best Actress for Demi Moore. The Substance was also nominated for Best Makeup and Hairstyling after the incredible transformation of the main character portrayed by Moore. And yes, many, many gallons of blood are included. Monocle's Fernanda Augusta Pacheco heard from the lead special effects makeup designer Pierre-Olivier Persin to hear about his work.
Pierre-Olivier Persin from The Substance. Welcome to Monocle Radio. I loved The Substance, but I have to start with this because we've just got the news. You've been nominated for an Oscar for Best Makeup and Hairstyling. Where were you when you saw the nominations coming out?
I was on set. That's the place to be when you receive an Oscar nomination. I was on set. I was dragging a dummy around, a dead body.
I would expect this from you,
Yeah. And so, I was on set, and the first AD came to me and she asked me, did you hear anything about the Oscars? And I said, yes, I have a nomination. And she said, oh no, I have to make an announcement. So she did in front of the whole crew, and everybody clapped, and that was great.
And I'm so happy because, for everyone that have seen the film, of course, the acting is amazing. Coralie, what a fantastic director. But, that side of it, the prosthetics, the makeup, hairstyling, everything, it's so important for this film. Was it perhaps one of the hardest projects from your career? I know you've been in this role for quite a while. Was that one of the most challenging one?
Definitely, yeah, for sure. That was the most challenging, demanding. It's always demanding. We love what we are doing. We are passionate about the work. So we always try to do our very best. On that show, we were making stuff, and then we were starting over again to do them better, and starting over again, back to the drawing board. And also Coralie really wanted to use as many practical effects as possible, which was great. She wanted really that organic, even old school from the 80s, but feel, but also very organic and feel to the audience. So I guess that's why she wanted really to rely on practical effects. And that was really great on her side to give us. It was really demanding. It was 24 hours. Pretty much not maybe 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for pretty much a year. And it's, I don't know if it's an overstatement. It's pretty close from the truth. But they gave us all the time we needed on set. They were never rushing us like, oh, quick, okay, you need time to do that. You need to shoot that in a couple of days, maybe because you can make it better and it does not work perfectly yet. Go and do it and come back in 2 days, no problem. And so that is really rare, and that was awesome.
I love what you just mentioned about the organic feel of the film, because I've noticed that as well. And I think it's particularly challenging on the substance because the film, there are a lot of close-ups. You really see what's happening with their bodies. You can hide it. If you haven't done a great job, Pierre, people would notice, right? So I think you understood, because some films that perhaps they're a little bit darker, maybe you can't really see what's going on. It's not the case with the substance.
No, that's a very good point. I remember many things happen in the bathroom, and most of the most complicated scenes, effects and makeup effects, and they happen in the bathroom. So I remember during prep asking Coralie about the lighting in the bathroom, some shadows and some typical horror movies kind of lighting to help with the practical side of it. And she said, yeah, sure. And then, we arrived on set, and I discovered the harsh, very harsh lights and the white tiles, on the walls, reflecting all the light and everything. I knew about the tight close-ups, but so wow. And but I guess, like you said, it really helps to be sucked into the craziness and the organic craziness of the story and the movies.
And to prepare, for example, Demi Moore and Margaret Qualley for the all the prosthetics, that must take quite a while. There must be quite a big part of their day. How many hours, for example, on a normal kind of day in the set they would take, especially Demi Moore, I would say?
Yeah. Demi had anything between 45 minutes to 6 hours, 7 hours, maybe for the longest. The usual day would be 3:30 to 5 hours of makeup.
That was Pierre-Olivier Persin talking to Fernando Augusto Pacheco there. And that's all the time we have today for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests, to the producers Chris Chermack and Hassan Anderson, and to our studio manager Lily Austin. For now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening. Have a great week.